I am Walter Kessler, 68 years old, and I still catch myself replaying the sound of my own son's laughter through a restaurant window, aimed at me like a weapon. I built a chain of auto dealerships from one rusted lot on the edge of Toledo into a regional empire worth $90 million, and I thought that empire would buy my family's loyalty. Last month, on the night before my knee replacement surgery, I asked my son to sit with me for 1 hour, so I would not go into that hospital alone. He told me he had a client emergency he could not miss. 2 hours later, I watched him through a steakhouse window, laughing with his wife and his father-in-law, popping champagne like the surgery didn't exist. So I picked up my phone, called my attorney, and started dismantling everything I had ever given him. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Son or daughter, doesn't matter. I consider every one of you family now. And if you've ever stood up to people who thought your kindness meant you were weak, hit that like button before we go any further. It was a Thursday evening in early spring, the kind where the light stretches long and gold over the Ohio flatlands. And I remember thinking that light looked like a lie, because nothing about that evening turned out to be gentle. I was sitting in my study at home, the house too quiet the way it's been quiet since my wife Eleanor passed 4 years ago, and I had my hand resting on my right knee, the one the surgeon was going to cut open at 6 the next morning. I'd been putting off that surgery for 2 years. Pride, mostly. A man doesn't like admitting his body is finally collecting on 40 years of standing on concrete showroom floors. I picked up the phone and called my son, Nathan. He's 34, my only child. And for the last 6 years, he has run daily operations at Kessler Auto Group, while I've slowly stepped back into what I told myself was a well-earned semi-retirement. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up, and I could hear the particular kind of background noise that tells you a man is somewhere he doesn't want you to know about: muffled voices, the clink of glass, someone laughing too loud for an office. "Hey, Dad," he said, and there was a strain in his voice I recognized immediately, because I used it myself for 30 years whenever I had to lie to my own father about where the company's money was going. "Nathan," I said, keeping it light, "I know it's late notice, but tomorrow morning they're cutting my knee open, and I was hoping you could come sit with your old man tonight. Order some takeout, watch a game, nothing fancy. I just don't want to spend the night before surgery by myself." There was a pause, a held breath, and then the sigh. That exact sigh a teenager gives you when you ask him to take out the trash. Except this teenager was 34 years old and married with 2 kids of his own. "Dad, I would love to. But Priya's dad flew in from Chicago for 1 night only, and we've got this whole dinner planned. I can't back out now. It would be a disaster. I promise I'll be at the hospital first thing in the morning, okay? You're gonna be fine. They do this surgery like 100 times a day." I told him I understood. I told him business no, family comes first, and hung up the phone, feeling that old, familiar, hollow ache settle into my chest. The one that comes from 40 years of telling myself that giving my son everything meant he'd never have to sacrifice anything for me. I thought about how I'd handed him the keys to 5 dealerships without making him earn a single one. I thought about how I'd paid off his house in Sylvania in cash as a wedding gift. I told myself, he's protecting his marriage, protecting the peace with his in-laws. A father should be able to spend 1 night alone. I wasn't going to fault him for choosing family harmony. But something in me, some old instinct built from decades of reading rooms, reading contracts, reading men who were lying to my face across a negotiating table, would not let it rest. I got in my car, still in my slippers, and drove myself the 14 minutes to Basso's, the one high-end Italian place downtown where I knew, because I know my son, he'd take a father-in-law he wanted to impress. I saw them through the front window before the host could even greet me. Nathan was seated in the best booth in the house, wearing a suit I didn't recognize, laughing with his head thrown back in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Beside him, leaning into his shoulder with a glass of Barolo in her hand, was his wife, Priya, and across from them, holding court with the kind of performative charm that only comes from old money pretending to be older, was her father, Rajiv Malhotra, a man who had made his fortune in commercial shipping, and who had never once, in 6 years, let me forget that his fortune was liquid, and mine was tied up in metal that depreciates the second you drive it off the lot. I stood in the parking lot in my slippers like a ghost outside my own life, and I watched my son fill Rajiv's glass, watched him laugh at something Rajiv said, watched Priya whisper something into Nathan's ear that made him glance toward the door. toward me. Almost, though he didn't see me and smirk. I walked inside. The host recognized me. Everyone downtown recognizes me. That's the price and the privilege of 40 years in a small city. I told him I didn't need a table, and I walked straight to the booth. Nathan saw me first. The laughter died in his throat so fast it looked like it hurt. "Dad," he said, and his voice had shrunk down to something small and childlike. "What are you doing here?" "I came to get a decent meal before they cut me open tomorrow," I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I always have, in every difficult negotiation of my life. "Since you were too buried with a client emergency to sit with your father, I figured I'd eat alone." Imagine my surprise. Rajiv had the decency to look uncomfortable. Priya did not. She reached over and put a manicured hand on my forearm, the kind of gesture that's meant to look like affection but is really about control. "Walter, please. We didn't want to bother you tonight of all nights." Nathan just felt terrible telling my father he couldn't make time for him after he flew all this way. I looked down at the table. There was a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's car payment, a spread of Osso Bucco and Branzino, and resting on a small tray at the edge of the table, catching the low restaurant light, was the Kessler Auto Group corporate card. Black, embossed, the card I had personally approved for exactly 4 executives to use for legitimate business development. I picked it up. Nathan didn't move. Nobody at that table moved. "Working late," I said softly, more to myself than to any of them, and then I bent the card in half with both hands until the metal snapped with a crack loud enough that 2 nearby tables turned to look. I set the broken pieces down gently on Rajiv's bread plate. "Happy almost surgery to me," I said. "Pay for your own dinner, son." And I walked out. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't even feel angry yet. Not really. What I felt was that old, cold clarity I used to feel in the 80s, back when I was 30 years old, sleeping in the back office of my very first lot, because I couldn't afford both rent and a payroll for my 2 mechanics. I drove home, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I didn't drink, and sat in the dark of my study, turning the evening over in my mind, like a man inspecting a car for hidden frame damage. It wasn't really about the corporate card. It wasn't even about missing one dinner. It was the sound of that laughter. It was the way Nathan hadn't defended me once, hadn't said a single word in my favor, while his father-in-law no doubt made another comment about how old-fashioned it is to sell cars for a living. It was the ease of the lie, the practiced, seamless ease of a son who has learned to lie to his father without so much as a flicker of guilt. A man doesn't develop that kind of skill overnight. He builds it slowly, testing the fences, seeing how much he can get away with before anyone checks. I did not sleep that night, and it had nothing to do with the surgery. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, sitting in the dark with the framed photo of my very first dealership on the wall, a single-wide trailer with a hand-painted sign, "Kessler Used Cars," the paint still cracked in the corner where a storm had damaged it 38 years ago, I made a decision. I was going into that operating room in 2 hours, and while my body was under, my mind was going to start working on something else entirely. I called my attorney, Marcus Delgado, at 5 that morning. Marcus has handled every contract, every acquisition, every legal headache Kessler Auto Group has faced for over 20 years, and he's the only man alive who has ever heard me raise my voice. He picked up on the second ring, already awake, already alert, because a call from me before dawn has only ever meant one thing in our history together: trouble. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told him what happened at the restaurant. I told him about the corporate card, about the laughter, about the 6 years I had watched Nathan slowly take over daily operations, while I told myself I was simply enjoying a well-earned rest. I told him I wanted a complete, silent forensic review of every transaction Nathan had authorized in the last 2 years, run entirely outside the normal accounting channels, so that nobody in the company, especially Nathan, would know it was happening. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me the question that would come to define the next month of my life. "Walter, are you sure you're ready for whatever we find?" I told him I'd built an empire out of nothing but bent nails and stubbornness, and there was nothing left in this world that could knock me down that I couldn't get back up from. I was wrong about that, as it turned out, but I didn't know it yet. They wheeled me into surgery at 6 that morning. Nathan showed up at the hospital at 8:30, 2.5 hours after the procedure had already started, carrying a coffee and an apology about insane traffic. And I lay there in recovery, my leg wrapped and throbbing, and I smiled at him and told him it was fine. "Son, These things happen. I played the part of the forgiving father flawlessly. I had no idea yet how much practice I was about to get. By the time I was discharged 3 days later, Marcus had assembled a preliminary report, and he drove out to my house himself to deliver it rather than send it electronically. He walked into my study carrying a stack of documents that must have weighed 6 pounds, and he set them on my desk without a word. "Walter," he said, "the corporate card dinner was nothing. Pocket change. What I found underneath it is going to make you sick." Over the past 18 months, Nathan had authorized just over $610,000 in payments to an outside company called Meridian Fleet Consulting, ostensibly for market analysis and inventory optimization services across our 5 dealership locations. I had never heard of Meridian Fleet Consulting. In 4 decades in this business, I know every consulting firm, every analyst, every fleet management outfit worth a phone call, and this company did not exist in that world. It had no reviews, no client list, no office anyone could find. It had been incorporated in Delaware 14 months earlier. Marcus had pulled the incorporation records. The registered owner of Meridian Fleet Consulting was a woman named Anjali Malhotra, Rajiv's sister, my son's aunt-in-law. The money wasn't going to a consulting firm. It was going straight into the Malhotra family's pockets, laundered through invoices for work that had never been performed. There were no reports, no spreadsheets, no market analyses of any kind, just invoices, vague and boilerplate, approved and expedited by my son every single month like clockwork. I sat there with my legs still elevated on a pillow, the anesthesia barely out of my system, and felt something in my chest go cold and still, the way the surface of a lake freezes over, quiet, total, and permanent. My son wasn't careless. He wasn't naive. He was systematically bleeding my company to fund his wife's family, $600,000 at a time, and he had been doing it while sitting across from me at Sunday dinners, telling me how proud he was to carry on what I'd built. I asked Marcus who else was involved, whether the money had gone anywhere beyond the Malhotras' pockets. He told me his investigator had traced some of the funds to a shell trust that had recently financed a very specific and unusual purchase, a series of consultations, paid for in cash, with an elder law attorney named Diane Farrow, who specializes in exactly one thing: guardianship and conservatorship proceedings for individuals a court has deemed incapacitated. That detail didn't make sense to me at first. I asked Marcus, out loud, who in my family could possibly need a conservatorship attorney. I genuinely did not understand. And then Marcus looked at me with an expression I will never forget, somewhere between pity and dread, and he said the 6 words that changed everything. "Walter, I think it's you." He explained what his investigator had found buried in an email thread between Nathan, Priya, and a name I didn't recognize, Dr. Samuel Everhart, a physician in Columbus who specialized in geriatric neurology. The emails referenced the assessment, the documentation, and a phrase that made my blood run cold. Moving forward with the petition once we have everything Everhart needs to make it stick. They were building a paper trail. They were preparing to have me declared mentally incompetent. I want you to understand something about the man I am. I did not weep. I did not rage. What I felt instead was the exact same feeling I used to get in a negotiation when the other side thought they'd outmaneuvered me and hadn't noticed they'd just handed me the one piece of information I needed to win. I asked Marcus to get me everything, every email, every text, every dollar. I told him I didn't care what laws we had to bend to get it, short of breaking any myself, and I wanted a specialist, someone who could dig where ordinary auditors couldn't reach. 3 days later, a man named Owen Rourke came to my house through the side entrance, carrying nothing but a laptop bag and a demeanor so quiet it made the room feel colder. Owen had spent a decade doing cybersecurity work for the federal government before going private, and Marcus assured me he was the best in the state at exactly this kind of work. Surgical, silent, untraceable. It took Owen 4 days working from my guest bedroom to breach the group text thread. Nathan, Priya, and Rajiv used to coordinate. What we found there was worse than embezzlement, worse than a lie about a dinner. They had been planning to have me declared incompetent using a falsified neurological evaluation. Dr. Everhart, it turned out, had a gambling debt of nearly $200,000, and Rajiv, through the Malhotra family's shipping business connections, had quietly paid it off in exchange for a fabricated diagnosis. early-stage vascular dementia, complete with invented cognitive test scores, and a doctored MRI summary. The plan was for Nathan to present this diagnosis to our company's board of directors, invoking a clause I myself had written into our corporate bylaws 15 years earlier. A provision allowing the board to transfer executive control to the acting president in the event the founder was medically certified as incapacitated. But it went further than the company. Buried in a text from Priya to her father, dated only 10 days earlier, was the real endgame. She wrote that once the guardianship was granted, Nathan would have full legal authority over my medical and financial decisions, and that there was a private long-term care facility outside Cleveland, a place, she wrote, where Walter can be comfortable and where he won't be a liability to anyone's plans. Rajiv had already toured it. They had already discussed moving me there within a month of the board vote, quietly, before I would even fully understand what was happening to me. I read that message 4 times. I thought about the little boy I taught to change his first tire in the parking lot of my very first dealership. The boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of my truck on the drive home from Little League. The boy whose college tuition I paid in full so he would never carry the debt I once carried. And I thought about how that boy had grown into a man who was, at that very moment, planning to lock his own father away so he'd never have to hear another word of protest. Marcus wanted to call the FBI that same night. He argued, and argued hard, that we had more than enough. The fraudulent invoices, the bribed doctor, the guardianship conspiracy to have Nathan, Priya, and Rajiv arrested before the week was out. I told him no. I told him that a man who tries to steal your money deserves prison. A man who tries to steal your mind, your freedom, your very personhood, that man deserves something he will remember every single day for the rest of his life. I told Marcus we were going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to become the confused old man Dr. Everhart's forged report described. I was going to let them believe every single lie they'd built was working flawlessly. And I was going to let them walk, with their own hands and their own signatures, directly into the trap of their own greed. For the next 10 days, I performed the role of my life. I called my longtime office manager, Denise, by the wrong name twice in 1 week. I misplaced a folder of routine paperwork and made a show of panicking about it in front of the sales staff. During a Tuesday morning meeting with our regional managers, I asked Nathan to repeat a set of quarterly numbers 3 times, rubbing my temples, mumbling that nothing was adding up the way it should. I watched him handle it with a gentleness that made my stomach turn the patient, condescending tone you'd use on a child, one hand on my shoulder, telling the room, "Dad's had a lot on his plate since the surgery." I left my home safe cracked open one evening when I knew he'd be stopping by to drop off paperwork, exposing old deeds and account statements, and I watched, from the hallway, the way his eyes lingered on it a half-second too long. Owen's surveillance confirmed what I suspected that same night. Nathan texted Priya that, "The old man is slipping fast. We might not even need Everhart's paperwork. He's doing our job for us." By the second week, Nathan had grown careless in exactly the way I'd hoped. He began approving even larger Meridian Fleet Consulting invoices. Sloppier now, barely bothering to disguise them. He stopped checking whether anyone in accounting might notice. He believed, fully and completely, that the man who built this company from a single trailer lot could no longer read a balance sheet. And then, I gave him the bait that would finish the job. I called him into my study on a Sunday evening and told him I wanted to discuss something important, a piece of land I'd had my eye on for years. 40 acres out along Route 20 near the interstate, perfect for a new flagship dealership someday. I told him, my voice deliberately soft and uncertain, that I didn't trust my own judgment anymore, that I was terrified of making a catastrophic mistake that could hurt the company, and that I wanted him to purchase the land himself, under his own LLC, with Kessler Auto Group guaranteeing the $8 million acquisition loan. An early inheritance, I called it. A gift, before I wasn't sharp enough to give it properly. I watched the greed light up behind his eyes, exactly the way I knew it would. He asked, carefully, whether it might be simpler, cleaner to keep Kessler Auto Group entirely out of the paperwork, to avoid what he called unnecessary board scrutiny. I feigned confusion, told him whatever made him comfortable was fine with me, that my mind wasn't what it used to be, and I trusted him to handle the details. He left my house that night practically floating. Owen's surveillance caught the call Nathan made to Priya and Rajiv less than 20 minutes later. And Rajiv, sharper and more paranoid than his son-in-law, argued exactly what I had gambled on. He said if Kessler Auto Group guaranteed the loan, the board would demand oversight, audits, a cut of the profits. And that oversight was the one thing they could not survive, because any real scrutiny would eventually unearth Meridian Fleet Consulting. He convinced Nathan to cut the company out entirely to mortgage his own paid-off house for the initial capital and use Meridian Fleet Consulting itself, flush on paper with $600,000 of my stolen money, as the guarantor for the rest of the loan. They signed the final loan documents on a Friday afternoon, sitting in Nathan's home office with mugs of coffee, congratulating themselves on outsmarting a dying old man's estate. I watched the live feed of that signature from my own study, and I felt something settle in my chest that was not joy. Exactly, but was close enough to it that I didn't examine it too closely. Because that land, the 40 acres out along Route 20 that I had generously offered, sat on the site of a decommissioned industrial tannery that had operated there from the 1950s until the mid-1970s, dumping chromium and industrial solvents directly into the ground for 2 decades before any environmental law existed to stop it. 3 weeks before I ever mentioned the property to Nathan, I had learned through a contact I've known since my earliest years in business, a man who now sits on the regional EPA advisory board, that federal regulators had quietly classified the site as a Superfund cleanup zone, pending final designation. Whoever held legal title to that land the day the designation became official would be personally liable for the entire cost of remediation. My contact estimated that cost, conservatively, at $8 million. Marcus delivered the news the following Monday, sitting across from me in my study with a folder of federal paperwork. The Superfund designation had gone final at midnight. Nathan and Rajiv, through Meridian Fleet Consulting, were now the legal owners of an $8 million toxic liability, secured against Nathan's mortgaged house and a shell company built entirely out of embezzled funds. And because Meridian Fleet Consulting's finances were fraudulent from top to bottom, the moment federal auditors opened those books to assess the cleanup liability, they were going to find every single stolen dollar, every fake invoice, every wire transfer to Rajiv's sister laid out in plain sight, with no one left to blame but the 3 people who had put their own signatures on it. I asked Marcus one more question before he left that day. I asked him to confirm the date of our quarterly board meeting. It was in 5 days. I arrived at that boardroom looking every bit the frail, fading man Nathan believed me to be, suit slightly too large, hands folded to hide any steadiness, eyes deliberately unfocused as our 7 board members took their seats around the table. Nathan arrived flanked by 2 attorneys I didn't recognize and wearing an expression of rehearsed, tragic duty. He waited for the routine agenda items to clear, and then he stood. He spoke first about my legacy: 40 years. A single trailer lot turned into an empire. My vision, my sacrifice. He built me up so the room would feel the fall more sharply. And then his voice shifted, dropped into something heavy with performed grief, and he told the board that over the past several months, he and his wife had watched my mind deteriorate in ways that broke his heart to describe. He pulled Dr. Everhart's fraudulent report from his briefcase and had it distributed around the table, page by page, while board members murmured and exchanged the kind of look you give a man whose father is dying in front of him. He invoked the incapacity clause. He asked, with tears he had clearly practiced in a mirror, for an immediate vote to transfer executive control to him, for my own good, for the good of the company I had built with my hands. I let the silence stretch, and then I laughed quietly at first, then fully, a real laugh that seemed to confuse the room more than any outburst could have. I reached under the table and pressed the small buzzer I'd asked our facilities team to install that morning, and the double doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. Marcus walked in first, and behind him came 2 agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and behind them, pale and sweating, unable to meet anyone's eyes, was Dr. Samuel Everhart, who had agreed 3 days earlier to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency on the bribery charge that could otherwise end his medical license and his freedom both. I watched my son's face lose every trace of color. I told the board, in a voice that had not wavered once in 8 days, that the medical report in their hands was a complete forgery, purchased with money stolen from this very company, and that the man who wept in front of them moments earlier had spent the last month conspiring with his wife and father-in-law to have me declared incompetent, seize my company, and quietly place me in a locked care facility outside Cleveland, where I would never again have the chance to object. One of the agents stepped forward and informed the room that federal authorities had, that very morning, executed a raid on Meridian Fleet Consulting's offices and frozen every account tied to it, accounts that were, at that moment, legally bound to an $8 million federal environmental liability that Nathan and Rajiv had voluntarily and enthusiastically signed themselves into 5 days earlier. Nathan didn't speak. He sank back into his chair as if the bones in his legs had simply stopped working, and I watched something break in his face that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, not because I regretted it, but because some small part of me, the part that still remembered a boy asleep in the back seat of my truck, had hoped until that very last second that he would somehow prove me wrong. The agent walked the length of the table and asked my son to stand and place his hands behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs closing was the loudest thing I have ever heard in a room full of people. I stood, straightened my suit, the one that had felt intentionally too large for 8 days, and suddenly fit perfectly again, and I told the stunned board that the president of this company had been terminated, effective immediately, and that we had actual business to attend to. The boardroom doors flew open again a moment later, and Priya rushed in, still unaware, a bottle of champagne in her hand and a smile on her face that told me she had been waiting outside to celebrate. She froze in the doorway. The bottle slipped from her hand and shattered against the hardwood, champagne spreading across the floor like something spilled at a funeral instead of a party. I did not offer her comfort. I told her, and the room, that federal agents were already at her home at that very moment with a warrant for Rajiv Malhotra, and that the house Nathan had mortgaged to buy a poisoned piece of land was, as of that morning, in foreclosure. I told her that everything they had built on my back was gone, and that everything they had built on their own greed was about to bury them. She didn't scream, not the way I expected. She just stood there, very still, and I watched 20 years of assumed security drain out of her face in real time. I looked down at my son one last time before the agents let him out. He didn't beg, not the way I once feared he might, not the way that would have made this easier or harder. I still don't know which. He just looked up at me and asked, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from him since he was 7 years old, why I hadn't just talked to him, why I hadn't just asked him what was wrong. I told him the truth. I told him that I did ask him the night before my surgery. I asked him for 1 hour of his time, and he chose champagne with a man he barely respects over sitting with his own father. I told him that everything after that was simply the truth catching up to a lie that had already been living in our family for a very long time. I had Marcus draw up new estate paperwork within the week. Every share of Kessler Auto Group that would have gone to Nathan now funds a scholarship for young men and women in this region who want to learn a trade but can't afford the training mechanics, welders, technicians, the kind of honest work I built my entire life on before I ever owned a single dealership. I sold the family home in Sylvania that I'd paid off as a wedding gift, and the proceeds went to the same fund. I still sit in my study most evenings now, the house quiet the way it's been quiet since Eleanor passed, but the quiet doesn't feel hollow to me anymore. It feels earned. I am 68 years old, and I lost the only son I will ever have to a disease with no cure and no mercy. The belief that love is something you're owed, rather than something you build, day after day, with the people who actually show up. If you take one thing from an old man who's spent his whole life reading people across a negotiating table, let it be this. Your generosity is not an invoice for someone else to collect on whenever they please. The people who truly love you will sit with you the night before surgery, no matter who's flying in from out of town. And the ones who won't, the ones who laugh behind your back and call your kindness weakness, they are not entitled to your empire, your name, or 1 more ounce of your trust. Protect your peace the way you'd protect anything else you spent a lifetime building, because nobody else is going to do it for you. If this story reminded you that karma always finds a way to collect what it's owed, hit that like button and tell me, where are you watching from tonight?